It's Tyler here in Estonia, and firstly I'm going to tell everyone I have a raffle I mentioned a few weeks ago. This is a New Year's raffle. I'm raffling 3 smartwatches, and you can sign up. It's free, and it's going to be a random drawing in a couple weeks. So please go and sign up for this raffle and have the chance to win a really cool smartwatch. And I'm going to talk about the concept of blind dating and why this gradually became very uncommon in Western countries. Anyone here who doesn't know this concept of blind dating, essentially what it was when there were often mutual friends that arranged for 2 parties, man and women, to meet on a given date and time somewhere, and neither of the parties knew each other. They may have known of each other, and they were then arranged. And there are different ways this happened, but this was much more common at least 2 or 3 generations ago. I think the boomers, this was a very big concept in the generation before them. Generation X, I think it still happened now and then, but not to the same degree as it had before, and it became very uncommon for millennials. And I think there's different reasons for this. This was probably their replacement to things like PUA and dating apps. This was kind of one of their unique methods of dating, and sometimes it worked, other times it didn't. There were always still stories where marriages were created from blind dates, but it was usually not the case from what I've read. And so factors why this became big and why it eventually declined. Okay, so obviously a long time ago, people typically, whether it was within family or social circles, typically were more likely to assist other person to find like a girlfriend, find a boyfriend. There was often just a lot more assistance given, and they really often wanted to see the person with whether it was a guy or a girl. Often this would be more so for the guy. They would want to see the guy have some kind of relationship and possibly marry. And this was a big trend during the boomer era when they were younger, and I think maybe before, and for some of Generation X. Obviously this trend, though, like I stated before, declined a lot. As we can see, this obviously meant that there would have to be a fairly high level of integrity and trust there, because if 2 parties were, especially on the end of the girls' end, because these mutual friends or acquaintances would have to have enough trust or faith that the guy was decent enough guy. And this was a different era, of course. This was when the word meant more. People were just more integrable for the most part, and more homogenous, of course, societies. Even in Western countries, generally, communities were much more homogenous. That's what a lot of these boomers tell me, my parents and people of that age group. You did not see nearly the number of, say, inter-ethnic relationships, people from different stratuses, different social statuses, like marrying within each other or even having relationships. And so this was, I think, one of the big things, obviously, that why it used to be more popular, because a long time ago there was more of kind of a invisible fence, you might say, where it was both followed by the man and woman. Typically, if it was crossed, it was probably more likely to be the man who was crossing it. But what this fence was is everyone in this circle, like village or community or social circle, these were the people typically that the girl or woman dated and may marry. This circle where most of the options came from. Now, there were times, of course, where it was crossed and they would find someone outside of that, but it was not as frequent like it is now. Communities, this is how communities kind of stayed with each other within communities or within cities. This was kind of the standard protocol. When you look at like this, so there was obviously a lot less options for guys to date or to marry. And this invisible line, over time, it disappeared. Yes, there were times where this invisible line was crossed, but like I said, it wasn't so common. And to avoid this blind date concept came forth, where maybe people who were acquainted with other people, and then they would bring the two parties together. And this was a different time era where, of course, women in general had a lot more respect for men. So they were generally more willing to at least give it a shot. Even if the guy wasn't like super high social status, they weren't super popular, they would often be at least willing to go on a date. I recall when I was in high school, there was a family friend of my family, and this woman, this was a small town in USA, she was like boomer age woman, and she had stated that when she was in high school, in college, basically she would at least be willing to go on one date with a guy that asked her out. And I think of that now, and she was very attractive girl when she was younger. And it just illustrates how different the mindset was. It was not this entitlement mentality like it is now. And that's one of the big things, is a more fresher, less tainted perspective was required. Even to present day, a guy could bring that to the table. I don't think a girl could, unfortunately. One of the things I think that also started coming up often was that whether it was indeed fact or not, there were guys that maybe were classified as creeps or weird, or kind of the rejected guys, and maybe these guys were the ones that ended up on blind dates more often, or that's how girls of that society started perceiving them. And this maybe was the transition point of Generation X, and why this trend started to decline, because girls were like, oh, this is the unpopular guy, or this isn't the sought after guy by all the girls, and this is why they're on the blind date. The mindset started to shift. Recall also what I've spoken about, that especially in Western societies, there's this natural tendency, especially among women, they're always looking outside. They're not focused, concentrated. It's not like monodimensional. I don't know the proper term here, where they're just focused on the person in front of them. And this was obviously a requirement a long time ago with relationships, marriages. You could even watch like films or find video footage from the 1970s, and you'll notice that there's a lot more focus often by the woman, and just look at their eyes and their body cues. So it was very different. It was more respectful. It was more submissive often to the guy. And furthermore, there wasn't this sort of external looking out like you see now, and we saw even 20 years ago. And what I mean is that now there's obviously the technology, phones. There's not this invisible fence that exists with women in general. So they see going to the local ghetto where all the bad stuff is happening. They look at that as fine game for dating a guy, or even for marriage, just as they would go look at a ski chalet with the wealthiest folks as also game to find like a 50-year-old guy. There's no like invisible fence here, and that's obviously quite different. The social norms a long time ago, that wasn't how society was. With technology, and as that invisible fence kind of eroded, and people just started looking further away. Even in the 1990s, people were looking further away from their communities. They were always thinking there was something better out there. And that's obviously became a big issue, because with that mindset, what would be the point of blind dates? That's the thing about it, because the blind date relied more on a scarcity perspective from the side of the woman. On the contrary, like nowadays, it's more of dating is from the scarcity perspective of a guy. Big difference here, obviously. And that's once that shift started becoming really prominent in cities, that's when the blind dating concept didn't really work out. And there, of course, were also maybe some situations that happened, some negative situations, perhaps even dangers, where maybe the party didn't know the guy very well, and they ended up there was something bad that played out. Maybe safety was another big reason why this concept became less popular. And the other thing is that it was presented more in media and in TV. This blind date was a very well-known concept. It was anything that's being broadcasted by large media in television is often what women follow, and this was really a big concept. Unlike nowadays, if I ask like some like younger people like in their teens, some don't even know what a blind date is. You think that like this was a really well-known concept. One of the more novelty dating concepts of like 30 or 40 years ago, and now people don't know what it is. It shows you though how popular trends, they come and go within relationships, and this was the case with blind dating. I think another trend was like PUA, certainly replacement, because PUA in some ways was kind of like a blind date, and it was kind of like a alternative form of a blind date when you think that it was kind of a mysterious guy presenting themselves to the woman, and it could have been international. They could be in Russia or Ukraine, meeting a foreign guy, completely mysterious. Certainly was one of the replacements. And just imagine, I mean, in 20 years, people may not even know what the term PUA is. The real young people, this could be the same thing as blind date. Another fine example of a novelty. Like I've mentioned before, you also had dating apps which were kind of like blind dating also, because it was an online version of someone and very misrepresentative, over glorifying their traits as a person, men and women together, but especially with women, and sometimes using fake pictures, fake videos, and then person would meet the other party and realize it looks like a completely different person. So online dating obviously became another kind of blind dating situation. As was the case with other areas of dating, it wasn't necessary for, and it wasn't really that desire for a lot of women, because they just simply had too many options. As time carried on, it wasn't like a long time ago, like what I was saying before, they did not have nearly as many options. When you only had one party that really needed a date, the women didn't really need a blind date, that in itself limited it. I mean, now you see a lot of women that they write into like these jail prison convicts, they want to engage in relationships with these guys. This would have been not at all a popular trend like 40 years ago. These would not have been game. These guys, it's like this invisible fence concept. These would have been like the untouchable guys a long time ago. If you've ever seen like the movie Runaway Train with John Voight, fabulous movie, you'll see kind of on the social hierarchy, prison convicts were very low. Nothing like it is nowadays. Yeah, there was a segment of women that were into these guys, but this was probably started becoming something bigger in the 1980s, that trend. But certainly not the masses. Also remember that dating, it wasn't as this concept of having a harem and having many options. Wasn't the common trend generations ago. I think for both men and women together, they weren't like necessarily looking at it like just consumer product, or looking at the person like consumer product. And it was probably easier to, like what I was saying, for both parties to be satisfied. Whereas it obviously became a lot more difficult. Like baby boomer generation of men were different in that sense that they don't really have the struggles of one woman after another, like discarding them for not being good enough, for another guy coming along, this shiny object syndrome, something they don't really have to deal with that now younger generations have to deal with non-stop. This was a major factor with how dating environment was then. So remember here that the blind dating environment, like PUA, like online dating, was a reflection of how society and culture was at that time, and that fit in with the kind of baby boomer culture in that time period. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.